The day everyone came to celebrate my retirement was the same day I learned that a lifetime of dedication could disappear from a single piece of paper. My name is Margaret Ellis, and after 40 years of standing in front of classrooms, guiding children through their first books, first questions, and first dreams, I thought I knew what it felt like to be appreciated. I was 67 years old when I finally retired from my position as an elementary school teacher in a small American town. I had spent most of my adult life inside those school walls, watching generations of children grow from nervous kindergarten students into confident young adults. I never became wealthy from teaching, but I never measured my life by money. My reward was seeing former students wave at me in grocery stores, hearing parents thank me for believing in their children, and knowing that my work had made a difference. So when my family told me they were planning a retirement party, I felt deeply touched. My son told me it would be a special afternoon surrounded by the people who loved me. My daughter-in-law, Linda, said she wanted everything to be perfect. She told me I deserved a beautiful celebration after giving so much of myself to others. I believed her. I spent the weeks before the party looking forward to seeing familiar faces and sharing memories. On the morning of the event, I chose my favorite blue dress and carefully arranged my silver hair. I remember looking in the mirror and feeling grateful. I was not thinking about awards or recognition. I was thinking about the people I had been fortunate enough to meet along the way. The party was held at a local community hall decorated with balloons, flowers, and photographs from my teaching career. When I arrived, my family greeted me with smiles. My grandson ran toward me and gave me a big hug. He was only 8 years old, but he had always been curious and honest in a way that made everyone smile. "Grandma, you look beautiful today," he said. Hearing those words meant more to me than any formal speech. I walked into the room and saw tables filled with old friends, neighbors, former colleagues, and family members. It looked exactly like the kind of celebration I had imagined. People laughed, shared stories, and talked about memories from the past. I felt overwhelmed with gratitude. Then I looked toward the front of the room, where a large welcome sign hung above the stage. At first, I only noticed the decorations. There were golden letters, pictures, and a message thanking everyone for coming. But as I looked closer, something felt strange. The sign was meant to honor my retirement, yet my name was nowhere to be found. I blinked and looked again, thinking perhaps I had simply missed it. Maybe my eyes were tired. Maybe the decorations covered part of the message. But no matter how carefully I looked, my name was missing. Before I could say anything, my grandson walked beside me, looked up at the sign, and asked in his innocent voice, "Grandma, why is your name not on the sign?" The room suddenly felt quieter. A few people turned toward us. I looked at my grandson, then back at the sign, and for the first time that afternoon, I felt that something about this celebration was not what I had been led to believe. I did not know why my name had disappeared. I did not know who had made that decision. But standing there surrounded by people who had come to honor me, I realized I was about to discover a truth I never expected on a day that was supposed to be one of the happiest moments of my life. For a few long seconds, nobody said a word. My grandson's innocent question seemed to float through the room before settling over every conversation that had been taking place only moments earlier. I smiled gently at him because I did not want him to think he had done anything wrong. Children ask honest questions because they do not yet know how often adults hide uncomfortable truths behind polite smiles. I looked back at the large sign hanging above the stage. It read, "Celebrating Family and New Beginnings." The decorations were beautiful. The flowers were arranged perfectly. My teaching photographs decorated several tables throughout the room. Yet the one thing that should have been impossible to overlook was missing: my own name. Linda quickly stepped forward with a nervous laugh and placed a hand on my shoulder. She smiled at everyone before looking at my grandson. "Sweetheart, it was probably just a printing mistake," she said. "The company must have forgotten to include it." Several people nodded politely, and the conversation slowly began again. On the surface, her explanation sounded reasonable. Printing companies make mistakes. Decorations sometimes arrive with small errors. I wanted to believe that was all it was. I truly did. I smiled and told my grandson not to worry because little mistakes happen sometimes. He accepted my answer and ran off to join his cousins near the dessert table. I told myself there was no reason to let one missing name ruin a wonderful afternoon. But as the party continued, small details began to catch my attention. Near the entrance stood a welcome table with printed programs describing the afternoon's schedule. Curious, I picked one up. It listed the order of events, including a welcome speech, a family slideshow, lunch, games for the children, and closing remarks. My name appeared only once in small print beside the words retirement celebration. There was no biography, no mention of 40 years in education, no recognition of the school where I had worked. I quietly folded the program and placed it back on the table. I reminded myself not to jump to conclusions. Perhaps the speeches would tell my story instead. After all, many people in the room already knew me well. While everyone settled into their seats, I noticed several former colleagues smiling and waving from across the room. They looked genuinely excited to celebrate with me. Their kindness comforted me more than they probably realized. Then the slideshow began playing across a large screen. I expected to see classroom photographs, school events, field trips, and moments collected over 4 decades. Instead, the presentation focused almost entirely on recent family vacations, birthday parties, holiday dinners, and photographs taken during the last few years. I appeared briefly in only 2 pictures, both taken from the edge of large family gatherings. My years as a teacher seemed to have disappeared completely. I looked around the room, wondering whether anyone else noticed. A few former coworkers exchanged puzzled glances before quietly returning their attention to the screen. No one wanted to interrupt the celebration. Neither did I. Throughout my career, I had taught children that respect meant listening before reacting. That lesson stayed with me now. I decided that before reaching any conclusion, I would simply observe everything carefully. Sometimes the truth reveals itself through patience rather than confrontation. As the slideshow ended, Linda walked confidently toward the microphone to welcome everyone. She thanked family members for coming, thanked friends for supporting the celebration, and thanked those who had helped organize the afternoon. I listened closely, waiting to hear the story of the career I had spent 4 decades building. Instead, her introduction remained surprisingly general, focusing on family togetherness and new beginnings without mentioning my work or the journey that had brought us all into that room. Sitting quietly in my chair, I realized the missing name on the sign might not have been an isolated mistake after all. It felt like the first piece of a much larger picture that I had not yet fully seen. I remained seated while applause filled the room after Linda finished welcoming everyone. The clapping sounded warm, but something about it felt strangely disconnected from the reason we had all gathered. I looked around at the faces of my former coworkers, retired principals, neighbors, and parents whose children I had taught. Many of them smiled at me with genuine affection, yet I noticed several of them quietly studying the program in their hands before looking back toward the stage with confused expressions. It was clear I was not the only person who had begun noticing that something important was missing. Lunch was served, and people moved around the hall talking in small groups. Former students approached me one after another, sharing stories that made me laugh. One young man, now a firefighter, reminded me that I had encouraged him to keep reading when he struggled in 3rd grade. A young woman who had become a pediatric nurse hugged me and said she still remembered the letter I wrote to her parents telling them how talented she was. Those conversations reminded me why I had spent 40 years teaching. Recognition had never been about trophies or ceremonies. It had always been about people. Even so, I could not ignore the growing feeling that the event itself had quietly erased the very reason everyone had gathered. As I returned to my seat, I noticed another detail. A memory table stood beside the stage displaying photographs from what should have been my career. Curious, I walked over to take a closer look. Most of the framed pictures showed recent family holidays, birthday celebrations, vacations, and neighborhood gatherings. There were only 3 school photographs among dozens of family pictures, and even those had been placed toward the back where they were difficult to see. I gently picked up one of the frames showing my first classroom nearly 4 decades earlier. Before I could study it, Linda hurried over with another polite smile. She thanked me for coming closer because she wanted everyone to begin gathering for the next activity. Her words were friendly, yet she carefully moved the frame back behind several larger family photographs. I said nothing. Instead, I quietly stepped aside and continued watching. Years spent teaching children had taught me that actions often reveal more than explanations. The afternoon continued with games for the younger children, conversations between relatives, and music playing softly through the speakers. Then I overheard two retired teachers standing nearby. One whispered that she had expected to see photographs from school plays, graduation ceremonies, and classroom projects. The other replied that she had brought several old pictures herself, but had never been asked to contribute them. Their conversation lasted only a few moments, but it confirmed that what I was seeing was not simply my imagination. Little by little, the missing pieces formed a pattern that became harder to dismiss. Just as I was gathering my thoughts, my grandson returned to my side holding a small slice of chocolate cake. He looked at me with complete innocence and asked whether I was happy with my party. I smiled and told him I was grateful that so many people had come. He nodded before quietly saying, "I thought they would tell everyone about your school because you always tell me teachers help change people's lives." His simple observation touched me more deeply than he could possibly understand. I placed my hand gently on his shoulder and thanked him for remembering. At that moment, I made an important decision. I would not let disappointment speak for me. I would continue watching, listening, and waiting until I understood exactly how this celebration had become a day where the story of my life's work seemed to have quietly disappeared. The longer the afternoon continued, the more convinced I became that the missing name was only one part of a much larger decision. I reminded myself that reacting emotionally would not help anyone understand what had happened. Instead, I continued doing what I had taught my students for 40 years whenever they faced confusion. Observe carefully, listen respectfully, speak only after understanding the whole picture. That lesson had guided countless children through difficult moments, and now I needed to follow it myself. As guests finished lunch, people began gathering near the stage again for what the printed program described as the appreciation segment. I quietly expected that this would finally be the moment when someone would speak about my career. Perhaps the earlier omissions had simply been poor planning. Perhaps the organizers had saved everything meaningful for the main presentation. I wanted to believe that possibility. Linda stepped back to the microphone with the same confident smile she had worn all afternoon. She thanked everyone again for attending and invited several family members to share short memories. My son spoke first about family vacations and holiday traditions. My niece remembered Sunday dinners at my house. My grandson talked about baking cookies together after school. Every story was sweet and sincere, and I treasured every word. Yet not one person mentioned the classrooms where I had spent most of my life. Not one person spoke about the thousands of children I had taught. Not one person mentioned the school that had shaped my identity for 4 decades. I looked toward the tables where several retired teachers were sitting. They appeared just as puzzled as I felt. One former principal quietly shook his head before folding the printed program and placing it beside his plate. A retired guidance counselor looked toward me with an expression of sympathy, as though she was beginning to understand what I had only recently realized myself. Then another unexpected detail caught my attention. Beside the stage stood a small podium displaying a framed certificate prepared for the celebration. From where I sat, I could see only the decorative border, so I walked closer while everyone applauded another family story. When I reached the podium, I noticed that the certificate thanked our family for gathering together to celebrate new beginnings. Once again, there was no mention of my years of service, my profession, or even my full name. It was another carefully prepared item that somehow avoided recognizing the very person whose retirement had brought everyone together. At that moment, the pattern became impossible to ignore. These were not random mistakes made by different people. They all pointed in the same direction. Someone had intentionally redesigned the celebration so that my career became almost invisible. I did not know why, and I refused to guess without facts. Instead, I quietly returned to my seat and watched Linda speaking with the event coordinator near the stage. They reviewed notes together before glancing toward me for only a brief moment. Neither appeared angry or nervous. They simply continued preparing the next activity. Their calm behavior told me this program had unfolded exactly as planned. My disappointment grew, but so did my determination to respond with dignity rather than resentment. I realized that if I spoke too soon, my emotions would become the focus instead of the truth. So I waited. I listened. I watched every detail. And as another round of applause echoed through the community hall, I quietly decided that before the afternoon ended, I would respectfully ask for a few minutes at the microphone. Not to embarrass anyone. Not to accuse anyone. Simply to tell the story that somehow had been left out of the celebration built around my retirement. As I sat quietly listening to another round of applause, I realized something unexpected. The more I remained silent, the more clearly other people began noticing what had been missing all afternoon. I did not need to point out every detail, because the room was slowly discovering them on its own. One of my former principals walked over and asked if I had enjoyed the slideshow. I smiled politely and admitted that I had expected to see more memories from my years at school. He looked surprised and said he had assumed the presentation would be entirely about my career. A retired librarian joined our conversation and quietly mentioned that she had even brought several old classroom photographs because she thought the organizers wanted to display them. She explained that nobody had ever asked for them. Her comment confirmed what had been growing in my mind since I first entered the hall. The absence of my teaching career had not happened by accident. Someone had deliberately decided what would be included and what would quietly disappear. Even then, I refused to become angry. Anger would only distract from the truth. I thanked both of them for coming and told them how much their friendship had meant over the years. A few minutes later, several former students gathered around my table. They shared stories about school plays, reading competitions, science fairs, and classroom traditions that I had almost forgotten myself. One young woman laughed as she remembered the small wooden treasure box I kept in my classroom for children who showed kindness toward others. Another former student recalled the handwritten notes I gave every graduating class, encouraging them never to stop asking questions. Listening to those memories reminded me that my career had never belonged on a banner or inside a slideshow. It lived inside people. Still, I could not ignore that the event created to celebrate my retirement had somehow avoided mentioning the very work that had defined my life. While speaking with my former students, I noticed Linda standing near the stage, reviewing the schedule with the event coordinator once again. She glanced toward our table several times before quietly rearranging a few papers on the podium. My son approached her, looked at the papers, and asked a question I could not hear. Linda responded with a brief smile before shaking her head. They appeared to agree on something and continued preparing the final portion of the afternoon. I watched only for a moment before returning my attention to the people around me. Then something unexpected happened. The Master of Ceremonies announced that the formal program had almost concluded and thanked everyone for helping create such a meaningful family celebration. I quietly looked down at the printed schedule still resting beside my plate. There was no place where I had been invited to speak. No closing remarks from the retiring teacher. No opportunity to thank the people who had supported me throughout 40 years in education. For the first time all afternoon, disappointment settled deeply inside my heart. Not because I needed applause, but because I wanted to express gratitude to the people who had shaped my journey. I looked across the room and saw my grandson watching me with the same thoughtful expression he had worn since asking about the missing name on the sign. His innocent question had uncovered something far greater than either of us understood at the time. I took a slow breath and reminded myself that dignity is often revealed in the moments when disappointment invites us to lose our composure. I stood up quietly, walked toward the stage, and waited patiently until the current speaker finished. Then I smiled politely at the Master of Ceremonies and softly asked whether I might have just a few minutes to thank everyone for coming. Whatever happened next, I knew my words would come from gratitude rather than resentment, because after 40 years of teaching children how to face difficult moments with grace, it was finally my turn to live the lesson I had taught every single day. The Master of Ceremonies smiled warmly and handed me the microphone without hesitation. I thanked him quietly before turning toward the audience. For a brief moment, I simply looked around the room. I saw former students sitting beside their children. I saw coworkers who had spent decades walking the same school hallways with me. I saw neighbors who had become lifelong friends. I even saw my grandson smiling hopefully from the front row. Suddenly, all of my disappointment faded because I remembered why I had chosen this profession in the first place. I adjusted the microphone and began speaking. Thank you all for being here today. Seeing so many familiar faces means more to me than I can possibly describe. The room became completely silent. When I accepted my first teaching job 40 years ago, I believed I was there to teach children how to read, write, and solve math problems. It did not take long for me to discover that children also teach their teachers. They taught me patience. They taught me optimism. They reminded me every day that kindness is often remembered longer than perfect grades. I smiled as I noticed several former students wiping away quiet tears. People sometimes ask whether I ever regretted becoming a teacher because it was not the highest-paying career. My answer has always been the same. Every time a former student stopped me at the grocery store to introduce me to their family, every time someone wrote to tell me they had graduated from college, every time a child discovered confidence they never knew they had, I received a reward that could never fit inside a paycheck. The room filled with gentle applause before becoming quiet again. I continued speaking, never mentioning the missing sign or the missing photographs. Today is called retirement, but I do not see it as an ending. I see it as the closing chapter of one wonderful season and the beginning of another. The lessons I learned inside those classrooms will stay with me for the rest of my life. As I paused, something unexpected happened. A retired principal slowly stood from his chair. He smiled warmly before saying, "Margaret, you taught at our school for 32 years, and thousands of children walked through your classroom. We would not be the community we are today without your dedication." Before I could respond, another former colleague stood beside him. Then another. Soon, teachers from different decades began sharing brief memories from the audience without anyone planning it. One remembered how I stayed after school to help struggling readers. Another spoke about the annual book drives I organized so every child could own books at home. A retired guidance counselor recalled the afternoons I spent comforting students who needed someone to believe in them. The atmosphere inside the hall changed completely. What had started as a family celebration quietly transformed into a heartfelt tribute from people whose lives had been connected through education. I looked toward Linda. Her confident expression had disappeared, replaced by visible surprise as she realized the program she had carefully organized was no longer following its script. My son looked equally thoughtful as he listened to story after story from people he had never met before. None of them sounded rehearsed. None of them exaggerated. They simply spoke from memory. My grandson looked up at me with a smile so full of pride that it almost brought tears to my eyes. In that moment, I understood something that no missing name on a banner could ever change. Recognition that comes from genuine gratitude does not need to be scheduled into a program or printed on decorations. It rises naturally from people whose lives have been touched. As the applause continued, I quietly lowered the microphone, realizing that the most meaningful tribute I could ever receive was unfolding right before my eyes without anyone being asked to create it. I remained standing near the microphone while the applause slowly settled into a quiet stillness. I had not expected the afternoon to unfold this way. I certainly had not expected former colleagues and students to stand one after another, filling the room with memories that no printed program had included. As I looked around the hall, I noticed something even more powerful than the applause itself. The atmosphere had changed. Earlier, people had politely followed the schedule prepared for the celebration. Now they were speaking from the heart. A retired music teacher stood and smiled through tears, as she recalled the annual reading festival we had organized together for nearly 15 years. She laughed while describing how I always arrived before sunrise carrying boxes of books because I believed every child deserved to leave with a story they could call their own. A former parent raised her hand from the back of the room and asked whether she could say something. Without waiting for permission, she stood and thanked me for refusing to give up on her son when he struggled with reading. She explained that the patience shown inside my classroom had changed the direction of his entire life. Her son, now an adult sitting beside her, quietly nodded with gratitude. One memory became another, and then another. Every story focused on service, compassion, encouragement, and the quiet moments that rarely appear in photographs, but remain unforgettable to the people who lived them. While everyone listened, I noticed Linda standing near the stage holding the event schedule in her hands. She looked toward the audience, then toward me, and finally back at the papers she had prepared so carefully. It was obvious that the afternoon had moved far beyond anything written on those pages. My son slowly walked toward her. They exchanged a few quiet words before he looked across the room at the teachers and former students who continued sharing memories. His expression softened as though he were seeing a part of my life he had never fully understood while growing up. Then something happened that surprised me even more. Linda stepped toward the microphone after the applause faded. For a brief moment, the room became completely silent again. She took a slow breath before speaking. "I owe everyone here an apology," she said quietly. "When I planned this celebration, I wanted it to feel modern and focused on bringing our family together. I thought everyone already knew Margaret's career, so I spent most of my attention on recent family memories instead. Looking at all of you today, I realize I made a mistake. I unintentionally minimized the work that brought us together in the first place. Nobody interrupted her. Nobody criticized her. The room simply listened. Linda turned toward me with genuine regret visible on her face. I thought I was simplifying the program, she continued. Instead, I removed the most important part of your story. I looked at her for several seconds before smiling gently. I knew that accepting responsibility in front of a room full of people was not easy. I walked beside her and quietly placed my hand on her shoulder. We all make mistakes, I said softly. The important thing is whether we learn from them. Those words seemed to release the tension that had quietly filled the room all afternoon. My grandson immediately ran toward the stage and hugged me tightly. Grandma, he whispered, everyone knows your name now. I laughed through happy tears because he had unknowingly captured the truth better than any adult could have. It was never the missing letters on a banner that mattered most. It was whether the people whose lives I had touched still remembered why I had spent 40 years walking into the same classroom every morning. As I looked across the audience one more time, I realized no decoration could erase a lifetime of kindness. No printed program could rewrite genuine memories, and no forgotten sign could remove a name that had already been written into the hearts of generations of children, families, and friends. After the applause finally settled, people did not rush toward the parking lot the way they usually do after community events. Instead, they stayed where they were, talking with one another as though everyone understood they had witnessed something far more meaningful than a retirement party. Former students introduced their own children to me, explaining that they had often shared stories about elementary school around their dinner tables. Parents I had not seen in decades came forward to thank me once again for believing in their sons and daughters during difficult years. Every conversation reminded me that a teacher never truly retires from the lives they have touched. While I spoke with guests, I noticed Linda quietly walking toward the large welcome sign hanging above the stage. She stood there for several moments, reading the words that had seemed perfectly acceptable only hours earlier. Then she called the event coordinator over and pointed toward the empty space where my name should have been. They exchanged a brief conversation before the coordinator nodded and disappeared into another room. I did not interrupt them because I understood that some lessons cannot be taught through criticism. They must be discovered through reflection. A few minutes later, the coordinator returned carrying several large gold adhesive letters left over from another event. Without saying a word, Linda carefully climbed onto a small step stool and slowly placed my full name across the top of the welcome sign. She stepped back, looked at it quietly, adjusted one of the letters, and then climbed down again. There was nothing dramatic about the moment, yet it carried more meaning than any formal apology could have expressed. Several guests noticed what she had done and began applauding once more. This applause felt different from the earlier applause. It was not celebrating perfection. It was recognizing humility and the willingness to correct a mistake. Linda walked over to me holding the folded event program in her hands. Margaret, she said softly, I cannot change the beginning of today, but I hope I can remember this lesson for the rest of my life. I smiled warmly because I believed she meant every word. The best lessons are usually the ones we never expected to learn, I replied. She nodded with tears in her eyes before quietly embracing me. My son joined us a moment later. He admitted that he had trusted every planning decision without asking enough questions because he assumed everything would naturally honor my career. He apologized for not noticing the omissions before the celebration began. I squeezed his hand and reminded him that families become stronger when people choose honesty over pride. My grandson looked up at the sign with great satisfaction and laughed. Now everybody will know whose party this really is, he said. His simple observation made everyone nearby smile. As guests prepared to leave, several retired teachers suggested organizing a reunion later that month dedicated entirely to celebrating educators who had served our community. They invited former students, principals, librarians, and school staff to participate. I gladly accepted because the idea was never about honoring me alone. It was about recognizing every teacher whose quiet work had helped shape countless futures. Walking toward the exit that afternoon, I glanced back one final time at the hall. My name now rested across the welcome sign, but surprisingly, It no longer felt like the most important part of the day. The greatest gift had been watching truth gently replace misunderstanding without anger, watching sincere memories overcome forgotten details, and watching my own family discover that a lifetime of service deserves to be remembered with the same care that created it. I left the building feeling lighter than when I had arrived, because respect restored through kindness lasts much longer than recognition demanded through disappointment. Several weeks passed after my retirement celebration, but the lessons from that afternoon stayed with me every single day. Life became quieter after leaving the classroom, yet I discovered that quiet did not mean empty. My mornings changed. Instead of preparing lesson plans and organizing activities for my students, I had time to enjoy simple moments I had often missed during my busiest years. I started taking longer walks through my neighborhood, drinking coffee on my porch, and reconnecting with friends I had not seen often enough. But the greatest change was how my family began seeing my journey differently. A few days after the celebration, my son called me and asked if he could visit. When he arrived, he brought a small photo album filled with pictures from my teaching career. I was surprised because I had never seen some of those photographs before. He explained that he had asked former coworkers and family friends to share memories because he wanted to create something meaningful for me. As we turned through the pages together, I noticed how many people had been touched by moments I had completely forgotten. There were pictures of classroom projects, school events, reading celebrations, and handwritten notes from students who had grown into adults. My son looked at each picture carefully and admitted that he had never fully understood how much my work had meant to the community. He said that growing up, he had simply known me as his mother who went to work every morning. He had not realized that to so many other people, I was the teacher who encouraged them when they needed confidence, the person who stayed late to help them improve, and the familiar face they remembered years later. I told him that every parent eventually hopes their children will understand the choices they made in life. For me, teaching had never been about being celebrated. It had always been about serving others. A month later, the reunion organized by my former colleagues took place at the same community hall where my retirement party had been held. This time, the decorations were different. There were photographs from decades of classrooms, handwritten messages from former students, and a large display showing the journey of educators throughout the community. When I entered the room, I immediately noticed something that made me smile. My name was not displayed alone. It appeared alongside the names of many other teachers who had dedicated their lives to helping children. That was exactly how I wanted it to be. The evening was not about one person receiving attention. It was about honoring everyone who had quietly shaped future generations. Linda attended the event as well. Over time, our relationship became stronger because we had both learned from what happened. She told me that the experience changed how she thought about recognition. She realized that removing someone's story, even unintentionally, can make them feel unseen. She also admitted that she had learned the importance of asking questions before making decisions for someone else. I appreciated her honesty because growth often begins when people are willing to look back and admit they could have done better. My grandson continued asking questions, just as he always had. One afternoon, while we were looking through old school pictures together, he pointed out a photograph of my first classroom and asked why I looked so young. Asked if I missed teaching. I thought about his question carefully before answering. I told him that I missed the children, the conversations, and the feeling of helping someone discover what they were capable of achieving. But I did not feel sad because those moments were still part of me. Retirement had not erased my purpose. It had simply given me a new way to share it. Looking back, I no longer remember that day because my name was missing from a sign. I remember it because a simple question from a child revealed something much deeper. A person's true value is never determined by what is written on a banner or printed in a program. It is measured by the lives they have influenced, the kindness they have given, and the memories that remain long after the celebration ends.